Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to respond to this short but very varied debate, and I apologise to all members who have taken part that I won't be able to give them the detailed answers that I think their contributions really deserve in the time available. But what I do want to do is try to respond to some of the points that they've raised, and I want to begin with the concerns my honourable friend from Milton Keynes North expressed about the drug cat. And I think it's fair to say the government shares his concern. He's right to point out that we don't have a great deal of information about the prevalence of the use of cat. At the moment, what we know is based on a 2010 estimate that something of the order of 0.2% of the population reported using it. He asked about gaining more information about that. I can tell him that now, since I think October of 2009, there are questions about the use of cat on the British Crime Survey, and I hope very much that will lead to more information for the government to use in making the appropriate decision. He may know that in 2006, the previous government decided to accept the advice of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs not to ban cat at that point. He will also know that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, wrote to the ACMD in February of this year asking them to review the available evidence now and to reconsider the question of controlling cat under the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. I can tell my honourable friend also that that work will begin in the autumn, and we therefore expect in the fullness of time to have a good deal of information available from the ACMD and conclusions the government can consider and decide what to do next. What he wouldn't expect me to do, and what I won't do today, is prejudge the outcome of that review by the ACMD, but I can tell him that it will be thorough, and I'm sure also that the ACMD will be interested in any evidence that he and others are able to bring forward for their consideration. But as I say, a decision that they take and then a decision that the government takes will be based on evidence, and that brings me neatly on to the remarks of the Honourable Lady for Brighton Pavilion. And she made two proposals to the government. The first was that drugs policy should be evidence-based, and the second was that we should move away from criminalisation of drug use and towards a more health-based model, and I'll deal with both of those if I may. The first point to make is that, in my contention, we already have a balanced drug policy, and it's right that drug policy should be based on evidence and that it should be balanced, not just on the issue of criminalisation, but also on other issues. And the title of the drug strategy to which he referred from December of last year begins reducing demand, restricting supply, building recovery, and all of those elements are important. And what we will do is continue to evaluate the strategy, make sure that it is delivering what it should deliver. But the strategy sets out, for example, that the commissioning of drug and alcohol treatment services will be a responsibility, a core responsibility of local directors of public health. So there will continue to be a health-related element of the government's drug strategy, and that's as it should be. There will also be an education element to the government's drug strategy. It's right to say also that young people need to understand exactly what they're dealing with a variety of illegal drugs, and they need to be discouraged from taking them. And that brings me on to the second area. Although I do recognise, and I understand that the Honourable Lady has a very limited time to make her case on this important issue, I've got an even more limited time to reply, and therefore I can understand we are restricted in what we say. But I do disagree with her, I'm afraid, that the right answer is to decriminalise the drugs that we're discussing. And the simple reason for that, it seems to me, is that to legalise something that was previously illegal sends out a very clear message. And the message that it sends is that society no longer disapproves of this item in the way that it previously did. That would be acceptable only if the effect of these drugs was not as damaging as it is. And I think the Honourable Lady must accept that if she's interested in evidence when it comes to drugs policy, the evidence is very, very clear that illegal drugs of the type we're discussing are extremely damaging. They're damaging to the individual who takes them, they are damaging to their families, and they are damaging to the wider community. And therefore, society should not take a neutral view as to whether they are a good or a bad thing. Society should take a strong view that they are a bad thing, and therefore those drugs, in the government's view, should remain illegal. Moving on, if I may, to the comments of the Honourable Lady for Bolton South East, I will certainly pass back to my honourable friend, the member for Hornsey and Wood Green, her invitation to visit Fort Alice House Refuge, and I'm sure she will consider that. I think it's right to say, as she has said, that the people who work there do a remarkably good job and offer a service that many people find extremely valuable. But I don't think it's right to conclude that the funding difficulties, which it's no doubt the government has to contend with across a whole range of fronts, mean that these types of services can't be provided. She will know that a substantial part of the local funding which comes to refuges such as hers in her own constituency come from the Supporting People programme. Now, in relation to that programme, within the current spending review period, £6.5 billion worth of funding has been secured. That is admittedly a reduction, but it is an average annual reduction over the 4-year period of less than 1% in cash terms. What is also right to point out is that there is also central funding available, and the government is making available £28 million of stable Home Office funding for specialist services over that period, including independent domestic violence advisors, independent sexual violence advisors, and coordinators for multi-agency risk assessment conferences. And these are all important services that she will recognise, and they coordinate, I think, with the types of services she's describing at the refuge in her constituency. Moving, if I may, from the government's commitment to prevent violence and abuse against women and girls, not just in the UK, but also more broadly, and therefore on to the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Battersea. She has, as she referred to, spoken powerfully on the issue of female genital mutilation in this House before. She's done so again today, and she's right that this is horrific abuse of often very young children, and it remains a crime, as she says, has been since 1985, but more specifically, under the Female Genital Mutilation Act of 2003, the maximum sentence for this offence has been increased to 14 years imprisonment, and crucially, and she made this point, crucially under this Act, the behaviour of British citizens abroad can be punished, whereas previously it could not be. And that is an important point for the reasons she gave, that occasionally this activity is transferred abroad previously to avoid the effect of the criminal law. But I think she would probably also agree that there are a number of other things that we can do, not just look to punish those who are responsible for committing these offences, but also improve the guidance available to prosecutors so that they are able to prosecute more often. She's right to say there have been no prosecutions, but it's worth noting there have been some 58 investigations into this offence. If there are difficulties with prosecuting, then it may be to do with the types of information and understanding that prosecutors need to have, and therefore later on this summer the CPS will be issued with new guidelines to assist them, we hope, to take forward prosecutions where that is appropriate. But as I say, I think she would also agree there's more we can do. We can raise awareness of this issue. It remains in many ways a hidden crime, and therefore we will attempt to get more government guidelines to teachers, general practitioners and nurses who need to understand the signs of these sorts of offences so that they can identify them. We also need to broaden awareness more generally, Mr Deputy Speaker, and we will send out, have already in fact sent out, some 40,000 leaflets and 40,000 posters to schools, health services, charities and community groups, because the wider society needs to understand what is happening. We also need to assist victims, and we are doing that already with 15 specialist NHS clinics offering a range of services, including so-called reversal surgery, and women can go to these centres direct. They do not need to be referred. And the final point to make is that, of course, this is a cross-government issue. It isn't simply the Home Office that needs to act on this, but also the Foreign Office, Education and Health Departments too. Finally, if I may turn to my honourable friend for Harrow East, Mr Deputy Speaker, who spoke, as he has before, about the tragic and very worrying events in his own constituency. And it is right, of course, that, as he says, the government is very clear about the consequences of knife crime, not just for the victims, but for the offender. So let me make it very clear that, so far as this government is concerned, those who commit a criminal offence using a knife can expect to go to prison. A prison sentence is available not just for an adult offender, as he knows, but also for young offenders too. And he will also be aware that within the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Bill, which is currently making its way through the House, the government proposes a new offence of having an offensive weapon in a public place and threatening someone with it. And that offence will receive a 6-month mandatory prison sentence unless that would be unjust in all the circumstances. He's right also to point out that we need to ensure resources find their way to this problem. And on that front, he may know that the Home Office has committed over the next 2 years, up to 2013, £18 million of support for police, local agencies and the voluntary sector to tackle crime involving weapons and youth crime more generally. That includes £3.75 million for the 3 police forces where most knife crime occurs, and as he would expect, that includes London. It's also important, and he did make this point too, that we support those community projects which help to deter young people away from involvement in knife crime. And on that front, he will be interested to know that the government has committed £400,000 to an organisation known as Kids Task Force, which helps with the education of school pupils on knife crime, and he may have come across them because their materials are used by schools in Harrow. I think the last point I would make on this, and this is something which I know he would also support, we have to make those who are tempted to carry a knife understand that doing so does not, as they may believe, make them safer, but in fact makes them less safe. And that is part of the education task that we have when we deal with knife crime. And that, I know, is something that he would wish us to pursue and which he would hope is pursued within his own constituency. Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, that doesn't cover in the detail that is justified all the contributions which have been made, but I'm grateful to you for allowing me to respond to the extent that I have. I wish you and all those who work in this building a very prosperous and happy recess.
Order.